That looks sweet.
Hi, my name is Tanya, and in the spirit of the conference, I just wanted to open with a little bit about myself. So I did a Bachelor of Science in biology and then took a few years off, but sort of kept my foot in the marine science world by volunteering for Reef Check before coming back to QUT to do a PhD with RRAP in the Rubble Stabilization Subprogram. And a fun fact about me is that I am a different person from one of my supervisors. She will be speaking after me. Her name is Tanya. She did a bachelor's degree in ecology. She took some years off before coming back to do a PhD in Rubble at UQ and did a lot of volunteering with Reef Check before that and is now a postdoc in the Rubble Stabilization Subprogram. I think the main difference between us is that she has a puppy and I don't. And she has a few more years experience, so save the hard questions for her. So without further ado, I'd like to get started by acknowledging the traditional owners where I work and study, and also further acknowledge that these places have always been spaces of teaching and learning. Today I want to talk to you about coral rubble and a little pitch for why we should care more about rubble, and some opportunities we have to understand rubble at scale that are very recent in the past couple of years, but I want to highlight the limitations around those data sets that at this point in time are not really fit for purpose for this particular substrate, and how I'm working to sort of improve some of that. So what is coral rubble? We have this concept of a healthy coral reef, and when there is degradation, we can see areas of healthy reef degrading to rubble-dominated areas. And in the GBR, where my research is focused, we're really worried about increasing cyclones in the future and these mass death like bleaching and COTS-induced disturbances. And we're interested in understanding that type of substrate because, as you've seen everywhere in this conference, we want to prioritize restoration and understand where restoration is necessary and potentially effective to pull rubble environments back to these thriving coral reef environments. However, restoration is expensive, restoration has risks, and I don't have a lot of time to talk about this today, but rubble is really cool. It's just this absolutely biodiverse environment. It has a lot of recruits in some cases for coral, echinoderms, mollusks, ascidians, bryozoans, all these things that are not the coral, and we haven't had a lot of time to investigate, but we don't want to necessarily intervene with that habitat unless we know that we need to, and that there's going to be a value in that intervention. So when should we think about restoring rubble? I would argue that we need to think about rubble in a temporal sense, and rubble is worth intervening in when that rubble cover is increasing, but coral cover is decreasing. So rubble is everywhere on reefs. I'm sure most of you have seen it. It's that natural cycle of life and death on the reef. The coral grows, it dies, and it creates this habitat for all these cryptic organisms. So we don't want to just look at rubble and necessarily immediately think of it as bad. But then we have large disturbances that create rubble quickly. So in this very simplified graph I've showed you here, I think of that transient area of rubble where the reef still has this resilience capacity. So in this image from St. Crispin Reef, there's these areas of rubble that we think were the result of a cyclone, but there's just a lot of evidence of corals quickly springing up in that space. So it might not be worth investing in restoration there. And then we have some other areas. This photo's from Moore Reef that we think hasn't really recovered since Cyclone Yasi, and that's that orange lines there where we have evidence and observations that this area used to have high coral cover, but is now this sort of degraded environment. So that might be the type of area we want to target. But in order to understand and know about that, we need information about rubble over large areas and over large spans of time. Otherwise, we can't make this sort of we can't see this from a single point in time photo. So lucky for us, and thank you probably to many of you in the room right now, we have increasing observations of coral reefs over time. But for either intentionally or unintentionally, rubble has often been this forgotten substrate. And it's either not targeted because it's not coral, or it's kind of looked over because it's not as beautiful or valuable potentially aesthetically. So keeping that in mind, I want to talk about products that we now have that are really cool, and then go into the limitations that are created by this sort of blindness to rubble as a substrate category. So in 2021, the Reef Authority published some maps at the scale of the GBR for offshore reefs. It's ongoing work. I'm told they're going to produce some newer, better maps covering inshore reefs as well sometime soon. And we have, at this scale, based on satellite imagery, this really cool, simple but important information about benthic cover across the reef. And lucky for me, one of those categories in that is rubble. So that creates some pretty cool opportunities to look at rubble at the scale of the GBR, which wouldn't really previously have been possible. But for now, this is just a snapshot based on 2018 data. And also, what I've found digging into this is that we really need to be careful about a successful sort of model output, and especially a model that's really doing a lot at a big scale and generating a lot of information, and using it in this sort of like niche market of rubble research, which is still quite a small area relative to a lot of other areas. So I'm gonna summarize about probably over a decade worth of effort and modeling into 3 pie charts. I'm not a modeler, so if you want to know more about models, talk to someone else, but I hope that this is conceptually a sort of simple step through of why we really need to be careful in the way we use these products. So conceptually, go on this journey with me. We started out and we wanted to teach a computer to say if something was coral or not coral. Success in that space, in that situation for a model is above 50%. So 50% is random. There's 2 categories. If we can get it to do better than that, then in a way we've succeeded. And obviously this is iterative and we're always improving. But this is opposed to sort of human accuracy, where we would kind of expect an expert to be able to tell you always if it's a coral or not a coral. That becomes different with different qualities and scales of imagery, but go with me on this conceptual journey. Then we add more categories. And so, again, accuracy is very complicated. The ways you calculate it are variable. But at the end of the day, if we get sort of 25% success in a model with these 4 categories, then we're better than random. And again, human success is going to be variable, but we would want an expert human to be quite accurate if we're looking at these 4 categories. But what happens in most of these benthic mapping efforts over the last sort of 10 to 20 years is that rubble, if it is a category in the map, is quite small. And so much like a human would, the model goes, well, hey, so this is actual data on the GBR. Rubble is about 7% cover across the reef. That's some relatively consistent across regions and across individual reefs. That model could theoretically be 93% accurate and get rubble wrong 100% of the time. And in fact, this is sort of what I've found in a sort of a literature review space. So I'm going to highlight 3 studies, and it might look like I'm picking on those 3 studies, but what I actually want to highlight is that these are kind of the best of the best in terms of what I've found. They are often doing geomorphic categories and benthic categories. They're looking at a lot of levels, and some of those categories they're doing really, really well. And these are the studies that have actually published what their categories are and what the accuracy for those categories is. So many studies say, hey, we did 50 categories, but our main goal was coral, and so here's the published results for 7 of those categories that actually worked. So for me, it's incredibly valuable when studies produce in a big appendix, perhaps, not in the paper itself, but actually publish the categories and what the accuracy is for all of those categories. So these studies are to be commended, not, even though it might look like I'm about to pick on them. So the first thing to keep in mind, going back to our lovely pie charts, is that 4 is actually a very small number of categories, and a lot of these studies are trying to do way more. So keeping that in mind, if they have a whole bunch of categories, and rubble, in my case, is just a small one, you can imagine what that leads to. In some cases, it leads to accuracies of between 0 and 2%. Why do we get this? So that top one was one of these things that I'm talking about has a really big effort, so it put a lot of work into its geomorphic categories, and they have really beautiful papers and data and publishing at that level. And they have some of that available for benthic classes as well, but it's kind of like the first stepping stone in that space. It's not fit for purpose yet, I would say. For rubble specifically, it does better in other categories. Then this middle paper, going back a little bit, did some mapping of the GBR, and they kind of split it up into regions, so they have different ground truthing strategies. And in some of these regions where you don't get rubble because they're not photographing every square inch of the reef, you get a lack of validation. So they have a 0% accuracy, but what that actually means is that they just didn't have enough data to verify rubble cover at all. So it's not, it's essentially a placeholder figure saying that this just isn't available, even though it was something that was initially sort of built into the design of the study. Then in which cases do we kind of get a little bit better? That same study for other regions of the GBR had really variable accuracy. And so again, this is just highlighting that in areas where they had a bit more observations of rubble, they were able to pretty rapidly improve that accuracy around this category. And then for this final study on the bottom there, they have sort of 34% accuracy. And a big confounding factor in that study was looking at rubble as rock. So rubble is a challenge because it's highly variable visually, and this key quality ecologically of rubble is that when it's loose and when it actually realizes its potential as a loose substrate and becomes mobile, it has all these impacts of killing coral recruits and needing that restoration intervention. But we can't actually tell that yet from most mapping efforts. So this confounding between rock and rubble is very understandable and very difficult to resolve for large-scale mapping efforts, but pretty crucial when we're trying to use these for management applications. So we need to keep in mind that that's not something yet that we can do reliably. So I would say this is a little bit of the unglamorous part of research, but I think it's really important. I've sort of stepped back from some of my initial ambitions in my PhD and trying to really clarify what rubble means and how it's defined when it's talked about in these mapping versus monitoring contexts, because it's sort of the same but different across these spaces. I'm trying to reanalyze some imagery from a rubble perspective and see if we can improve these accuracies. And I really want to encourage and advocate publication of these sort of confusion matrices, although I was a little bit sad when I first came across that term in the research. It felt too close to home. But yeah, so just advocate for publishing this sort of like the things that don't work in your study and letting that be a stepping stone for someone else's research into something that hasn't been targeted yet. So I think that rubble is really an interesting and important part of coral reef habitats, and it could be used as an indicator of degradation on larger scales. It's not quite yet fit for purpose, and so we need mapping efforts that focus on rubble to understand this aspect of the reef habitat better. And finally, there's just all of this amazing work, millions of images. I'm sure you're seeing it everywhere in the conference. We need to leverage those resources and work on ways to reanalyze that data that already exists, because it would be just insane to not use that massive bank of imagery that we have from the last decade or so, or more in some cases. So with that, thank you very much. And any questions?
Any questions for Tanya? It's for the online people.
Hello. Great. Okay. We have a problem with, okay, you know what's a reef and you know what's rubble, kind of. But the sand-rubble interface, is so much rubble is sandy rubble or rubbly sand, you know. So there is this integration that's a problem for us. And then, I guess, how do we categorize? And how do we draw the line? And is there an ecological basis to what lives there that we can draw the line by looking at something? Like if it's got coral and algae versus it's yucky stuff, you know what I mean? So we're just confused on what is rubble and what is rubbly sand or sandy rubble.
I mentioned I'm part of the rubble stabilization subprogram, so I spent about a year thinking about what rubble was and what stabilization was. I think the short answer is that coming back to that problem of rubble hasn't been the focus. It's always been a sort of additional category. When we've had definition is a problem in so many areas. And when we have people that focus on, say, geomorphology, for example, there's a really good body of work where they've poured through I don't even know, a century of geological terminology to say, hey, we've refined it, this is how we've refined it, this is what it means. Not everybody has to use it, but at least here's a platform for how we define it and describe it. And that's it's a really big job, but I would love to see that done for Rubble as a platform for moving that research forward, because everyone has solved that problem in different ways. So some places have Rubble, they have percentages. They might say like 10% Rubble, 80% Rubble. Ecologically, I think you'll hear a bit more about that in the next talk, but there's not a survey methodology. There's very little understood sort of holistically about the ecology of that environment. And so, no, that's a great idea, and it's a work in progress. But yeah, it fundamentally comes down to the few studies where it sort of has been a focus are often totally distant in space and time, and so we don't have consistency yet. But yeah, that's something we would, I think, as a team, we're kind of trying to work towards.
Please join me in thanking Tanya.